when our supervisors are requested, or whenever there's a critical incident that's emerging, that supervisors go to the scene, and many do. Again, this is not a criticism. Many go to the scene, they assume command, and they give direction. It's no secret that our workforce today is very young, and more today than any other time I've seen it in this department. It is absolutely critical that supervisors are present in the field and leading these young officers. So that said, on that fateful evening, I want to talk about a few supervisors. The first two supervisors that did respond after this tragic shooting incident, both were assigned to the 10th Precinct Special Ops, starting with Ed Braddock, also known as Sam. He took charge immediately. Senior Sergeant, he set up the crime scene, and his partner, another Senior Sergeant, Craig Shamrick. Craig Shamrick also at number 10, he took the lead on setting up a perimeter. Keep in mind that after the shooting incident, the suspect had escaped the location, and it's always critical in these quickly evolving active shooter situations to establish a perimeter. And this sergeant did that. And then I want to talk about another sergeant from the 12th Precinct, Sergeant John Claiborne. Now, John, his assignment for the evening was the desk. He was in charge of the station. But what did he do? He did what we expect. He got up out of his chair and immediately responded to the scene because he knew, based on the fact that Supervisor McLean requested supervision, there were other officers who responded to support McLean and his partner, got up out of the chair, and as he got up out of the chair, he immediately got on the radio, because you got to understand there was a lot of activity going on, the frequency at that time. Imagine a crisis that's quickly emerging, and over the air you hear officers screaming. It's a chaotic scene. Officer down, shot fired, officer down. That's the type of situation that they were dealing with. And yes, Sergeant Kidd was very aware of what was happening. He was listening to the radio, because as we looked at his video, we could listen to the officer saying, he's been shot, he's been shot. And then at some point, Sergeant Claiborne, not at the scene yet, but doing his best to get there from the station, he's on the air giving direction. He's taking a leadership role. He says, load them into the scout car, get them to the hospital now. And it was at that point the officers started responding to that, that leadership and that direction. They took those officers and transported both officers to the hospital. And then there's another sergeant, Sergeant Zinga Moore, another leader. Number 12, took a leadership role, because when the shooting took place and the suspect got out away from the location, it was this sergeant that assembled a search team who began to methodically search the area for this armed and dangerous suspect. Now, as we continue to watch the video associated with Sergeant Kidd, as troubling as him not going directly to the scene was the fact that at one point he's in conversation with what appeared to be a newer officer staying next to his cruiser, and suddenly you see roughly 4 to 5 officers running in a direction possibly where the suspect was concealed. And all he could say was, they must know something that we don't know. But here was the part that caused me grave concern. We should get cover. I'll say it again, we should get cover. As this police chief, I've been a supervisor, a manager, in excess of 20 years. as a police chief, 10 years plus, 10 plus years, I can tell you, I know of no time where I've seen this kind of neglect, and some could infer from my statements, maybe some cowardice. We should take cover. I remember as a young sergeant in Los Angeles, faced with a very dire situation with a man shooting off of a freeway overpass. I was a sergeant 1 week, and we had to deal with that situation. And it was at that point I realized I'm in charge. 2 black and white LAPD scout cars drove up alongside me and said, "Sarge, what are we going to do?" I says, "We're going to go in and deal with this threat." And we did that. No hesitation, made a decision, and dealt with the threat. So when I tell you that it was Supervisor McLean, and I'm going to continue to say that because that's how he's going to be remembered, he made a decision facing a serious threat. He knew it was a pretty serious situation, but he responded. And maybe, we don't know, maybe his colleagues know. As police officers, we know what kind of sergeants work our shifts. I don't know. Many of you now know, based on the information that's gotten out, that when Sergeant Kidd was an officer, he was terminated. I remember the case because it was so troubling to watch his female partner fighting a mentally ill person, and I believe it was a hospital or a detention facility, and he stood by and did nothing. One of the things that trouble me the most when I have to make assessments on officer misconduct is 3 areas that really incense me: cowardness, lying, and engaging in criminality. Those 3. So I'll close on that note, but our officers deserve better from Sergeant Kidd. And I know many of you have heard. I will tell you that I have received a number of contacts from people in the organization who are angry, who are frustrated, and want him fired. As you now know, very quickly, when I learned of this after our 72-hour brief, I quickly suspended him. He's in a suspended with pay status. We will be moving very quickly to address this case. So with that, I will take any questions you might have.
Chief, can you say, I believe it was 2014 he was fired, is that correct?
That is correct. And he was filed by a police trial board. For those who don't know, pre-bankruptcy, that was the way discipline was addressed, serious cases of misconduct. There was an impaneled police trial board. Everyone in the organization knew how I felt about this cowardice at the time, and that board made a decision to terminate. And like in any of these cases, it's not always final with the police department. He was then considering a arbitration hearing. He had already been in a suspended state without pay for 64 days. The department entered into an agreement that he wouldn't go to arbitration and that the 64 days would stand. Now, as some of you may know, was it 64 days? 68. Oh, 68 days, I'm sorry. 68 days. As I began to look through, because again, I put emphasis on the fact cowardice is a very serious allegation for me. And when I look back to try to understand how we entered into a plea deal on this case, there was a form with my signature on it, but not my signature. It was not my signature. And so there are questions I have to ask right now. I don't remember having a conversation over this case. I'm not saying it could not have happened, but a case this serious, I would not have wanted to agree to 68 days because that was a serious allegation. And there are many in this organization who are aware of it, who remember this case. And certainly the rest is history. He entered into a plea agreement, and he came back, subsequently got promoted to the rank of sergeant. And I will say this because I had a conversation, and I believe that Willie Bell was then the chair. I may not be accurate about that, but he remembers this case. And the commission struggled over his promotion to sergeant because of his prior disciplinary history. But for contractual reasons, we couldn't stop the promotion.
To be clear, sir, are you saying your signature was forged?
I hate to use the word forged because that constitutes a crime.
Yeah.
I would just say that someone signed my name and it was not my signature. Now, has that ever been done? Rarely, especially on a significant decision. Even if I'm out of town on vacation, if David or James or the acting chiefs of police, they will call me and say, I want verbal approval because this is a significant decision. And they might sign for me. Generally what happens, there's a signature. David would sign his full name and then it would say for. That's the process in place. And so I was stunned as we looked back at the records and saw this signature. And the other thing that everyone in this organization knows, I sign in one color and one color only. That color would be green. I keep a green pen with me at all times. I sign in no other color. This signature was in purple. Now, that might sound minuscule, not really important, but it is important because many of the viewers, your listeners are wondering, how could this person who had a serious allegation that was terminated be returned to the Detroit Police Department?
Chief, based on what you know about Sergeant Kidd, should he or should he not return to the force, and why?
There's many reasons. Gross neglect of duty, certainly not fitting of a supervisor. Some might think within sitting you just demote him to the rank of police officer, where he was a police officer, and there was a sustained allegation of cowardice. And again, I'm cautious not to directly call this a cowardly act because I can't get into his state of mind at the time. But clearly when I described that scene for you, at this point, after the officers were transported to the hospital, he moves closer to what I call the epicenter of where the shooting took place. And that's when you see him standing outside of his police cruiser and a group of officers are running by. At that point, I would have expected him to join, to provide the necessary leadership. And again, I don't know if this was the same group that was led by Zinga Moore, but certainly once officers knows that they're going in and they have isolated an armed and dangerous suspect who just shot 2 of our officers, all hands on deck. It's appalling. And I speak not just for myself, but I speak on behalf of every man and woman in this police department who are deeply troubled by what they know. And certainly there have been some retirees that have made some posts concerning this sergeant.
Chief, the body cameras, these seem to show the good and the bad through this. When you're able to look at stuff, you're able to tell whether officer or sergeant has done well and not. Are you happy with the body cameras?
I'm very happy with the body cameras for a lot of reasons. One thing that is done, and I know officers appreciate the fact that it can exonerate officers for false claims of misconduct. It gives us an opportunity to make sure that we're delivering the type of service that we're expected to deliver. It certainly can be used as a safety mechanism. Many times, and again, I'll go back to our 72-hour briefing. We're able to go back, recreate a crime scene using the video technology from those body-worn cameras, and we can make an assessment. We can make an assessment on the good and the bad. And let's just say that's the bad if let's say there's some tactical errors. It's an opportunity for us to learn, make adjustments in how we train, and we've done that several times as well. So it's beneficial to our business.
Chief, will you be releasing the video of this incident anytime soon?
At this point, I hadn't planned on it. I may down the road. At this point, we have consulted, Professional Standards has consulted briefly with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office in determining whether or not this sergeant's actions amount to criminal misconduct, possibly a misdemeanor, but we're not certain as of yet. But we are going to move quickly on this investigation. We think it's important to do so. I know I said last night that I would consider going before the board and requesting suspension without pay. Depending on how fast we move on the investigation, I may opt to not do that and move forward with a termination case.
Do you think you should be charged?
Charged criminally?
Yeah.
Partially. I just don't know. We are still investigating. It's a very, I'm more concerned about dealing with the administrative side of the investigation, but based on the recommendation of Professional Standards, we may be considering presenting charges over to the Wayne County Prosecutor.
Could that also include gross neglect of duty?
Well, it would be one, I don't know, Chris, can you help? Because I know this is Chris Graveling, for those who don't know. Chris Graveling, former U.S. Attorney, who now works for the Detroit Police Department. He is the Director of Professional Standards Section. Chris?
So under Michigan law, there's a willful neglect of duty. It's a misdemeanor crime. And so that's what we would be asking the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office to potentially consider once we get all the footage over to them, and then ask them to consider that as a potential charge.
And what's the potential punishment for that?
Being a misdemeanor, it's imprisonment less than 1 year. And off the top of my head, I forget the fine, but I think it's a $1,000 fine.
Chief?
Oh, sorry. In your experience, do you see that in this, or is that too hard to say?
I think that's going to be one of the assessments for the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. I think there's facts, as Chief has enunciated them, that could lead one to take a look and seriously consider making that charge. But that's going to be up to the Wayne County Prosecutor.
She said
Thank you, Chris. No, that misdemeanor, state.
Yeah, state misdemeanor.
State misdemeanor charge. Again, I want to continue to stress throughout this briefing that this is not reflective of the vast majority. And I think, I hope I clearly articulated some of the great work that our men and women who hold supervisory positions in our department. I can think of one, and you might help me on this, David. The supervisor, when we had an active shooter situation on the east side, a number of people were shot, 3 women were shot fatally by an active shooter, and it was a sergeant who went into that crime scene under fire and initiated rescue. What's his? Corsetti, Sergeant Corsetti.
40 years on the job.
40 years on the job. And he's out initiating rescue efforts. Sergeant Corsetti, and he's assigned to what precinct?
11.
11 precinct.
Chief, are you also planning to hold somebody accountable for not informing you that kid was promoted to sergeant and brought back in this way?
No, you know, process issue. You know, Chris and I have talked frequently about some of the failures that we have seen in our disciplinary system at times. Not my signature. And it's a very serious offense, especially one that I was very vocal. I was very vocal about this case because I had not even then, we talk about cowardice. How do you stand by and watch your partner take a beating? And I think at one point, if my memory is correct, he even walked away at some point. So it was a very serious allegation.
For clarity purposes, your signature that you're saying wasn't yours, what were you signing off on?
That I was agreeing to the plea agreement. So the issue was the department fired him. The command officers that heard the case made a decision to terminate. Then Officer Kidd. And contractually, they can do a couple of things. One, they can go before an arbitrator and and hear the case, and then a decision can be made as to whether or not the dismissal should stand, or they can return the officer back to duty. I think a lot of folks are not clear that once I make a decision, and the trial board under the old system acted for the chief, and so that's not the final stage. Many times an arbitrator will hear a case and return the officer. We have currently some very high-profile cases where I've terminated officers that's soon to go before arbitration.
Did this case go before arbitration?
It did not, because what happened, instead of going to arbitration, the department entered into what we call a plea agreement. And the plea agreement was, he took 68 days, suspension without pay, and so they said that's time served, and restored him to the department.
Is there any update on the investigation? And I've been out of pocket for a few days, but when we spoke Friday, you talked about possibly this could have been prevented. You had to look into whether the subject in the Wyoming home 2 weeks ago was able to identify him, and it was a little murky. Can you clarify at all whether that's
That's
crystallized?
separate from this.
Yes.
We are still investigating that matter. It's how the drive-by shooting was handled.
Right.
And so we have some concerns in that case, and we are still investigating it.
Okay.
And I'm not prepared to pass judgment at this point.
Chief, when it comes to Sergeant Kidd, is it strictly the video, his video, that shows you what happened, or did you have other officers on the scene that night coming to you saying, what is this guy doing? What was happening out here?
I didn't get that unless my colleagues got that. They brought to me the video. This was part of the overall, when we do a 72-hour briefing, we look at every aspect of the incident. We hone in on tactics, supervisor response, leadership and control, because that way we can make assessments early in the investigation and determine whether or not we need to do something different. Instead of waiting for a several-month-long investigation, we've been doing it on every officer-involved shooting, and it works very well. In this case, of course, what came out was the fact that supervisor was requested and frankly didn't get to the scene until well after the officers were transported for medical treatment.
When you saw that video, were you furious?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to speak for one of my assistant chiefs. He saw the video before I did, Assistant Chief James White. He was so angry, halfway through it, he realized what was going on. He got up and walked out. And he said, when the chief sees this, not good.
When you found out that he got his job back as an officer, were you able to protest that? Or how did you find out he got his job back, and then how did you find out he was promoted to sergeant?
You know, this is a large organization, and so I don't track every officer. I remember the situation because I remember the encounter that he was dismissed from, but I do remember that the Board of Police Commissioners, when, like in every sergeant lieutenant promotion, the names that we're going to promote go to the commission for their review, and there are times that the commission will have some strong concerns about some candidates because of their prior disciplinary history. And sometimes it depends on how long ago the discipline was that we can't use that to prevent them from promoting. And I think my memory serves me correctly, that might be the case here. But when I spoke to Willie Bell this afternoon about it, he vividly remembers this officer.
Important to point out that the promotions are
How
done
long
by
was he on
list.
the force?
Oh, and and I want to and thank you, David. Just for folks who may not understand, once we conduct a promotional assessment, a list is developed and candidates are placed in numerical order. And so there are times that we can skip a candidate. It could be off serious, recent misconduct. But if it doesn't meet that window, I think it's what, 2 or is it 3 years?
2 years and so many days.
Yeah, 2 years. So it's 2 years. So if it's beyond 2 years and some days, we have to promote.
Chief, there's unfortunately a lot of layers to this whole thing.
Yes,
And when you think
very
about-
complex. And I will tell you, it's something else I wanted to clarify, and I think it needs to be said now, and this is going back to the suspect. This is a very complicated case. We're talking about a shooting incident that started at the home 2 weeks ago. I were led to believe that he was going there to seek out the 16-year-old. As it turned out, the suspect was in a relationship with someone who lives in that home. And that person is an adult, 32-year-old female. On that date, he went to the home, and her son didn't want him there, refused entry, and subsequent to that, he shot the house up. We've also learned that he actually stayed there several days a week. He didn't live there permanent, but he was there a couple of days a week. And so, however, the 16-year-old is a factor because we believe that was part of his rage. He had some kind of dating relationship with her, and there was a subsequent shooting over his rage behind her. We have not located the 16-year-old, and we are still in the process of trying to locate her.
She's not related to the 32-year-old.
She is not, there is no relationship between the 32-year-old and the 16-year-old. Separate relationships.
Did the 16-year-old live in that house?
Does not, no, there's no connection.
Oh, okay, all right.
Again, we were led to believe
Okay.
that he was there. We didn't know that he had multiple acquaintances at the time.
Can you tell us how the internal investigation is going, since we all think, just looking at it now, this could have been prevented?
You're talking about, well, it's two separate cases. We got the case involving the neglect, alleged neglect on Sergeant Kidd. Very separate.
Very separate.
That would not have changed what happened.
I'm talking about the other one, the
Yes, that's still going. That investigation is being led by Deputy Chief Elaine Bryant. And so no decision on that at this point. We are taking a thorough look at what were the failures. This one could be more process. And when I said the comment several days ago about I believe this could have been prevented, certainly you're talking about an incident that happened 2 weeks ago, and if there had been a rigorous follow-up trying to identify who was responsible for that shooting, and we could have located him, we could, and knowing now that he's on parole, we could have taken action to revoke his parole and continue with that investigation. Those other 3 shooting incidents happened after the shooting in an inhabited dwelling. So it is a concern for us, and we're taking that investigation very serious, because it's not just our officers that were shot. You have 2 police officers that are victims, and then 4 additional civilians.
Chief, what's your message to any other Sergeant Kids or anyone else out there who might be complacent?
I think my message is clear. And Simon, I know what you want me to say, and I'm going to say it again. The vast majority of our supervisors do it the way we want them to do it. Are supervisors going to make bad decisions at times? Absolutely. As a supervisor, have I made bad decisions? Yes. Heck, I may have made some bad decisions as the police chief. I own it. I take responsibility for it. And one thing I learned as a young supervisor that I will always take with me, and I share this with newly promoted sergeants and lieutenants, the option is never to not make a decision. You make the decision, and when you make the decision, you own it. If it's a bad decision, you own it. But you made a decision. But not making a decision, avoiding going to a scene like this and assuming command is never an option. You wanted to be a sergeant, you want to be a lieutenant, you go to the scene and take control. I think everybody in this organization understands that. That sergeant who was seated on the desk, he knew, I'm in charge of this station. He got up out of his seat and immediately responded to the scene, and in doing so, he He was on the air delivering direction. Sergeant Kidd, conversely, was assigned the call and not once got on the air to take a leadership position. Not acceptable. And he will be held accountable for his actions, or inaction, I should say.
Chief, quick question. Going back to the call at the house that Officer McLean and his partner responded to, you said he was in a relationship with a 32-year-old at the house and stayed there part-time. Was it a home invasion call? Can you clarify that a little bit?
And that's where there was so much confusion. Initially, when we got to the call, it almost seemed as if the occupants did not know the suspect. So there's someone in our house with a gun. Factually, that someone in your house with a gun is a person that has lived there part-time. That's what we found out later. And so, had we known that, it might have been treated differently. Because there's a lot of things that we're finding out about this suspect now from some of those occupants that if we had known that day. We also know that the occupants, did make an effort after that initial report of shots fired, that they came back to the station to provide more detailed information on that suspect. So we're in the process of really digging into that because I want to know, how did the ball get dropped there? We really want to know the answer to that.
And who was at the house that night? You mentioned he was in a relationship with a 32-year-old. Her son lived there as well. Who was at home the night?
I don't know. Everybody was there. I believe that her son definitely was there. And this was the same young man who would refuse entry 2 weeks prior. And that's the son of the 32-year-old.
What was the, I'm sorry, rapid fire questions. What was the date of the drive-by?
I don't have it. Does anybody here have the date of that? October 30th? October 30th.
How long was he, or is he has he been on the force?
I want to say, I had that information.
98, so 21.
21 years, sergeant for year and a half.
And do you have any update on timing and when you think charges could be brought to the prosecutor's office for review, or are the case?
We're in the middle of an investigation that we just launched as of yesterday, so I don't have a timeline for you.
Okay.
As you know, we're still in a grieving place right now, trying to deal with not one but two officers we recently lost. Any other questions?
Was the son, I'm sorry, the son of the 32-year-old, is he the one who called 911?
I don't know who called 911, but there was a 911 call. When the officers arrived, Supervisor McLean and his partner were the first unit on the scene. They did an assessment. They interviewed the occupants who were outside of the home at that point. And you see throughout the video where it was clear that Officer McLean had taken a leadership role, even to the point when the decision was made to make entry, one officer suggested force the door open. McLean says, we don't want to damage the house. We'll just get the key and open the door. Because he understood we can force entry into the house, damage the house, and what's the point? One of the things that I've been hearing, I've gotten so many calls about Officer McLean, someone who certainly works at Sinai, really praise him as a very professional and thoughtful police officer who did just a wonderful job. And those sentiments have been echoed. But he loved doing his job.
I'm sure you touched on this point. I think you're right. We're going to get a lot of emails. Viewers are going to ask this. How did a guy with this kind of background get promoted to sergeant? What would you tell people?
I would tell you, in part, contractually, and I think I pointed it out, people have passed. They engage in misconduct. It sometimes results in dismissal. Sometimes that's overturned by an arbitrator. And once that person comes back into the organization, the possibility does exist that they could be promoted. And I know it's hard for some to grasp that. I understand it because sometimes past behavior is a predictor of the future. And now you take a person who got fired as a police officer for cowardice, who now is wearing chevrons, who is out leading and guiding these young police officers, these men and women who are putting their lives in the line each night. We rely heavily on our sergeants, again, as I said earlier, more today, because we know we have a very young workforce. And I got to tell you, and this is not a slam because they do phenomenal work. I got so many instances where they have responded to very dangerous situations, and it was handled by them and not by a senior supervisor. Because genuinely what usually happens when there's a situation that happens in the field, it is that officer who has to make a split-second decision to do something. And they do. They respond. And most of the time, 99.5% of the time, they get it right. But again, when you're youthful in this kind of work, there's a time for learning, and that's why sergeants are so critical to any police department, not just the Detroit Police Department, any police department. Most important job in the police department.
Do you think he should not have been promoted to sergeant?
Oh, looking back at everything I know now, of course I do. But again, I have to follow the rules too. I may not want to promote someone because of a pass, because a person has overcome a dismissal and been reinstated. It's out of my hands. I can't not do it because I don't, I just can't do it.
Just so that we understand, when someone's going to be promoted, can you as a chief step in and say, no, I don't think we should do this?
I can do it if the conduct or misconduct was recent. And I can do it if there's some other issues that it's just very tight. I don't think we've had, I tell you another difficult area, unlike my appointments, I appoint everyone at the rank of captain and above. Those are appointments. I can de-appoint without cause. But when you talk about civil service positions like the rank of sergeant and lieutenant, I cannot de-appoint because they're not appointed, but there's a civil service protection surrounding their job. And there's a contract. I can't just violate the contract because I don't feel someone's suitable.
I'm not talking about demoting him, I'm just wondering, like, when his name came up for promotion to sergeant.
I already indicated that. It was asked and answered for now the third time. That this individual, there was a conversation with the police commission. They were very reluctant, but based on contract, we could not stop his promotion because the distance between the misconduct and the time of his promotion was it in excess of 2 years?
It was excess of 2 years, and then it was also the time that he was suspended, so that's why.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.